of the noble ladies Baroness Morris of Yardley, Baroness Grey Thompson, and Baroness Ludford, who has apologized for not being in her place this evening. I'd like to apologize to the House myself for having been unable for medical reasons to attend the second reading debate of this important bill. I watched the debate with much interest, however, and was impressed by the very wide range of issues raised and the very strong feelings with which many of these issues were discussed. For me, however, the key point was made in the second reading debate was made by my noble friend, the Minister, Baroness Williams-Trafford, who, introducing the debate, described this bill as having one overarching objective, namely to keep the public safe. My Lords, I devoted almost the whole of my professional life to advancing this objective, both in this country and abroad, and it's for this reason that I enthusiastically welcome this bill and welcome the opportunity also to speak to this amendment. If I were asked to name the most important lesson I had learned from my long experience of policing on both sides of the Atlantic, I would say that it's the importance of accurate, timely, and comprehensive information in reducing crime and making communities safe. Without such information, policing and crime reduction becomes simply a matter of guesswork and luck. With such information, however, our police forces and those who advise and assist them can begin to understand why, when, and where crimes occur, and can begin to develop effective evidence-based plans, strategies, and tactics for tackling them. In a nutshell, my Lord, the more comprehensive, consistent, and timely and accurate the information available to our police forces, the more effective will be their efforts and the safer will be our communities. Everyone who cares about policing and public safety recognizes this. And it's this concern for consistent, accurate, and comprehensive national information which accounts for Section 44 of the Police Act 1966, which gives the Home Secretary the power not only to require all forces in England and Wales to collect, maintain, and return information about criminal behaviour in policing, but also gives the Home Secretary the power, quote, to specify the form in which this information is to be provided. It's this power to specify the form of the information to be provided which makes our national collection of criminal statistics so useful. For it's this power which permits the Home Office to issue its so-called Home Office counting rules, a set of memoranda which spell out in detail what information is to be collected by individual forces. These rules, which are kept regularly up to date to reflect new crimes and other changes in legislation, ensure that our national collection of criminal information is accurate, comprehensive, and timely, rather than a set of random figures which reflect the whims and preferences of individual chief constables or police and crime commissioners. My Lord, I've made something of this Home Office counting rules because I wanted noble lords to appreciate that there already are in place tried and tested arrangements for collecting information from the police, and also for ensuring that these collection arrangements are easily amended in the light of practical experience on the ground. For this reason, I hope very much that this evening's debate and at this late stage, we will concentrate on the main proposals of this amendment and not get bogged down in discussing the modalities of how this information should be collected. These are matters of detail for practitioners to consider in the light of the general principles which Parliament lays down for them, and not matters really for primary legislation. Let's turn, therefore, to the heart of this amendment. This amendment aims to fill a serious gap in our national collection of criminal statistics, caused by the fact that at present police forces are not required routinely or consistently to collect data on the sex of all alleged victims or perpetrators of crimes. As a result, practice in relation to the collection of sex data varies across forces, And in recent years, there's been a confusion with gender and related concepts, such as gender identity, which has been compromising the accuracy of our national data relating to sex. For example, most police forces are currently allowing biologically male alleged perpetrators to self-identify as women, even when charged with rape, and then recording the crime as carried out by a woman. As is obvious from this example, our present laissez-faire attitude to how sex is recorded by forces across England and Wales has important practical consequences. It deprives policymakers and police practitioners of accurate, consistent national statistical data about discrimination on the basis of sex. It thus makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to develop effective evidence-based policies for fighting these crimes, and especially fighting crimes relating to violence against women and girls, the tackling of which is one of the government's principal objectives and to which it is committed by international agreement. Now, this amendment aims, my lords, to fix this problem by amending the Police Act 1996 to require all forces to collect for each person who is, one, the alleged victim of a crime reported to the police, or two, who is arrested for a crime by a member of that police force, at least one, and in some cases, two pieces of personal information. The first is the sex registered at birth of that person, whether the alleged victim or arrestee, and the second is the acquired gender of that person, provided he or she has a gender recognition certificate known as a GRC, which legally recognizes their acquired gender in the UK. Now, I'm sure that some noble lords would wish to argue that neither of these categories are appropriate in the context of the criminal justice system, and that forces should collect only information on an alleged victim's or arrestee's gender identity as he or she declares it to be. My lord, let me deal with this argument in stages. As for the requirement that forces should collect information about the sex registered at birth, I should have thought that the case for this was obvious. Since criminological research began, information about the sex of victims and arrestees has been collected and analyzed across the globe by sex registered at birth. In my view, it would be nothing short of vandalism to permit forces at their own volition to stop collecting such information. This would at a stroke destroy the essential consistency and therefore usefulness of our national collection of criminal statistics. Another more detailed argument for collecting information about sex registered at birth is that because of the special arrangements whereby people with GRCs receive a new and altered birth certificate, not recording sex registered at birth could compromise accurate sex data. I appreciate that the number of people with GRCs is now small, but all forecasts are for it to grow significantly over the coming years. Yet another reason for collecting this data about the possession of a GRC is that experience has shown that it's very useful for overall sex data to be disaggregated so that both sex registered at birth and acquired sex can be interrogated as separate data fields in research. This is essential for the protection both of women and those who have GRCs. Now, what about a person's self-declared gender identity? Why don't we simply require forces to collect this information rather than the sex at birth or the acquired gender of those with a GRC? The simple reason, my lords, is that at present, in this country, the concept of gender identity is neither definable nor defined clearly enough in our law to form the basis of a reliable, accurate, long-term national information for use in internationally recognized criminological research or even as the basis for policy making at home. Now, this leads me back to the issue of collecting information on those with GRCs. There's been much passionate discussion in recent years, particularly on social media, about how trans people are treated by the police and other parts of the criminal justice system. But because forces are not recording accurate sex data or data about people in possession of GRCs, much of this debate is based not on accurate information but on an anecdote. This cannot be a sensible way to debate important societal problems or to develop effective policies for tackling them. Hence the case for this amendment. It would give us reliable, timely, consistent national data about whether the victims of crimes and the perpetrators of these crimes are male or female, a question which presently cannot be answered with confidence. For these reasons, I commend this amendment to the House. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed after clause 170 insert the new words as printed on the marshalled list. My Lords, Baroness Brinton is participating remotely, and I invite the noble lady the Baroness to speak now.
My Lords, I wish to speak against this amendment because on first reading it, it set off a number of alarm bells. But I do want to say to the noble Lord Wasserman that I listened carefully to what he was saying to try and understand his arguments, because for me, there are consequences in the amendment that face no other group of people with the protected characteristics that they would have to face in our society. Those who've laid and spoken to amendments in this bill against transgender people have repeatedly said there's a data collection problem. But I don't understand why the data needs to be collected by the police, given that for most crimes, whether the victim or the person being arrested as set out in this amendment, being a trans person is just not relevant. A parallel example would be requiring a disabled person to register with the police. My Lords, I've chosen this example deliberately because 4 years ago I was physically attacked in my wheelchair at Euston Station. For that incident, the wonderful British Transport Police recorded the crime as a disability hate crime. The crime, note, not the victim and not the perpetrator. I would be appalled if every time I reported a crime thereafter, online fraud for example, I had to say, by the way, I'm disabled and I'm on your disability register. Rape offences are probably the only offences where the police need to know the sex of the offender because the legislation is dependent on the person's genitals. Otherwise, it isn't relevant information because the police don't need to know it. Lord Wasserman says it's easy to add one section to the crime reporting information system, Chris, but is it so easy? Adding just one extra category will take time, and for an existing reporting system, it's usually very much more expensive than expected. Just ask the government about the costs of adding the booster jab details to the COVID app, and they've thrown millions at IT during the pandemic. I note that the amendment says the above does not constitute an offence under Section 22 of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which prevents the disclosure of this protected information. So on what grounds is it acceptable to share people's protected characteristics when the GRA says that that is private information? And in the context of personal information, can the noble Lord confirm if the amendment complies with GDPR? I'm not sure that it does, as it isn't personal information that's essential to record. So I return to why the amendment was laid. Can the noble Lord answer some questions to try and explain the aims of the amendment? And I'll give a hypothetical example. A trans individual is subject to house burglary or to a street mugging unrelated to their gender. This amendment requires them, if they report that crime, to out themselves to the police. Why should they suffer that loss of privacy and human rights? To what end? And why should trans people face such a disincentive to report crimes perpetrated against them? Why is this the one group of people being singled out as victims? Why trans people? And a second example. A trans person is arrested for being drunk and disorderly, but they've been assaulted and in fact are suffering from concussion, which can give the same appearance. That would be a defence in any charge, but they are required to out themselves upon arrest. Why? A key tenet of our law is that accused persons are presumed innocent and have mostly the same right to privacy and liberty as all citizens. That's different to criminals, and Lord Wasserman made reference 2 or 3 times to crimes and criminals. But that's not what this amendment says. It says anyone who is arrested. And what is the position of an accused person who refuses to provide the relevant information? The amendment does not make this clear. Would they be obstructing a police officer in the execution of their duty under the Police Act 1996, section 89(2)? My lords, a further real concern about this amendment, if enacted, is that it would prevent trans people from coming forward to report being victims of crime, as they would have to out themselves. Many would not be comfortable with disclosing that sort of information. It also implies that a gender recognition certificate is what defines gender, whereas many trans people don't have or don't want one of them. The fundamental problem for me, though, is the labelling and targeting of trans people, either as victims or those arrested by the police, alone of any other group in our society. Whilst this amendment may not be instructing them at this stage to wear a pink triangle on their jackets at all times, this would be a data pink triangle. It would set them apart from every other grouping in society. It sets a dangerous and unacceptable precedent, and I hope the noble Lord will withdraw the amendment.
I've put my name to this amendment, and I would like to speak in support of it, and I very much welcome the way in which Lord Wasserman presented the argument. I think he gave a lot of detail, and at this time of night I won't go over it again, but I do just want to emphasise 1 or 2 points. May I say to begin with, I sort of understand Baroness Brinton's points, and I take them seriously, because anybody who thinks any proposed legislation will discriminate against one group deserves to be heard and deserves to have those questions explored. But I think what's at the core of this is the collection of data. We are an immensely data-rich society at the moment. And sitting here throughout the debates this evening, there have been so many times when the argument that's been put forward has depended on the collection of data. And whichever public service you look at, whether it be education, health, the criminal law, whatever it is, much of the progress that we've made over previous decades has been because we have had the ability to collect data. And I'm a woman, and I think that my sex has made many advances over the last decades because people arguing for legislation that's protected women and protected men and protected people with disabilities and protected people who are transgender have only been able to make the case because they've been able to collect the data. Unless you've got the data, you're arguing vaguely about some impression about something that might happen. So I am deeply wedded to the idea of collecting data in the formation of public policy and in the advancement of political ideas. So I think that's defensible, but I don't take for granted the fact that we don't give something up in the collection of that data. I'll be honest, I'm a trustee in a number of charities, which I think everybody in this chamber is. And every year when I get asked to fill in the data declaration, I see another bit of data there. And sometimes I think, why do they want to know that about me? And the one I'm saying that at the moment is sexuality. I sit there, I think I tick the box that says heterosexual. I thought, what's that got to do with me being a trustee on this particular board? But I sign it because I think that on the whole, that declaration of bits of information about ourselves can be put to the common public good. And if we were to look at charities, without declaring that information, how do we ever get to make the argument that women aren't represented on charities, that people who are black, or ethnic minorities aren't represented on charities, people from the gay community aren't represented on charities? So I think whether we like it or not, and I accept that it's difficult to come to terms with sometimes, it is the protection and the rights and freedoms of individuals. But I would never say that we don't pay a price for the collection of this data, and I would never say that we mustn't continuously and constantly make sure that the data we're asking to be collected is in the public policy interest. And that's why I come to this amendment, and that's why I very much support the arguments that have been made. Simply, what the amendment asks is that we collect 2 bits of data amongst other. One is the sex at birth, and two is any acquired gender that has been acquired throughout the lifetime of a person. And without that, I don't know how we go on to develop public policy, both in the pursuit of those who have committed crime and in the public duty to protect those who have been victims of crime. Unless we've got the data about how many of which groups there are, I think they get ignored. And I've sat through a very, very interesting and long debate today, and from my noble friend from the front bench said that one of the most important things about this bill before the House is that it is a bill about protecting women and girls. I don't know how you do that unless you actually collect the data. So I think that the idea of collection of the data, we've heard about county lines, we've heard about knife crimes. Unless we collect the data to know that many of the people who are persuaded and drawn into committing those crimes are young men, we can't develop a suite of policies that actually supports them. And so when we collect data about sex, I think it's entirely proper to ask about acquired gender as well. And we mustn't conflate the two. And I think the problem at the moment is different police forces are collecting data about sex at birth and gender acquired at some other point, and they're conflating the two, and we've not got that sequencing of data and information across the police forces in this country that can enable us to make public policy. Now, that's what this amendment is asking. It wants to disaggregate those, as the mover of the amendment said. It wants to begin to collect the data so that public policy can follow it. But it doesn't ignore the fact that this is sensitive and must be done in a confidential and sensitive way with a clear purpose of public policy. And it's not beyond the wit of our society to collect that data in a way that does exactly that. The amendment doesn't say how it will be collected, and it's easy to make an argument that it will be about outing yourself or declaring it publicly. It need not be, because that isn't required. I'll go back to the purpose of this amendment is the collection of accurate data in the proper pursuit of public policy and the protection of individuals. And I very much hope that the Minister will give it serious consideration and let us know their views.
My Lords, I'd like to thank the Noble Lord Wasserman for tabling this amendment to which my name is attached and for very clearly explaining it. I'd also like to thank the Noble Lady Lowdy Morris when she talked about public policy interest, and that is the reason that I've attached my name to this amendment. I believe that the collection of consistent, routine and accurate data is paramount, not least in order to provide the correct services and support for both alleged victims and perpetrators of crimes. But the data has to be consistent in terms of being able to spot trends, allocate resources, and also make historical comparisons. In the past, the words sex and gender have been used interchangeably, and this is no longer the case. So a clear definition and understanding of what information is useful and appropriate to be recorded is important. And my Lords, I agree with the Noble Lady Brinton to a point that people need to be safe, feel safe and be encouraged to come forward and report crimes. But I'm afraid I don't agree with her when she talks about having a register that outs people. That is not my intention with supporting this amendment, because disclosure can be an issue and it can trigger strong emotions and fears for some vulnerable individuals. And as legislators, we must understand and address such fears, but also recognise that they are not a sufficient reason to compromise accurate data collection for the benefit of everyone in society. So it's really important that data is taken in a careful and sensitive way. And by carefully gathering this data, this amendment, I believe, seeks to partly help policymakers in making decisions for support for alleged victims and treatment of those who commit crimes, but also to provide consistency, and going back to what Lady Morris said about providing the best information we can to make good public policy.
We clearly have a division in the House between those of us who quite clearly do understand the way in which terms sex and gender are used and have been used, not just in this country, under several bits of legislation, most importantly the Gender Recognition Act, but also in international law. And there is a growing body of international law in which gender and sex are well understood. I simply want to ask the Noble Lord Wasserman just to explain 3 points that he had in his speech. First of all, he said that this was the intention of this law and this amendment was to keep the public safe by the accumulation of accurate, appropriate and timely consistent data. If that data is not aligned with a person's gender identity, then it won't be accurate. So how can he ask us to accept something? He told us that we shouldn't get bogged down in modalities. Well, this is about a very practical exercise of gathering data, not in a theoretical way, not on the basis of gender-critical beliefs, but actually on the basis of people's lives. So doesn't he think that that's important enough to put detail to put into primary legislation? And the final thing was that he said that experience has shown that it is very useful to gather information about sex and gender. Whose experience, and could he give us more information about that?
I'll speak briefly. I thank all noble lords who spoke to this. It's a controversial amendment, but I think it was spoken to quite sensitively, all things considering. Maybe it's the lateness of the hour. Maybe that was a good move. Here's the thing. I agree with the last speaker that difficulties in the drafting of an amendment can't just be dismissed as modalities, because when we put forward draft amendments to legislation and say must, we need to examine what that means. If police forces in England and Wales must keep a record of the sex registered at birth of each person, etc., how is that going to be executed, and what will the consequences be? And so one has to imagine that one is poor, younger version of the noble Lord Paddock back in the police station, back in the day, and people turn up to record whatever it is, a theft, you know, whether it's shoplifting or burglary or a violent offence, whatever. And how is this must recording of the birth sex as well as the subsequently declared sex, let alone the gender recognition? How is this going to happen? And what is the sanction for the must? That is not a modality. That is what law requires. A must has to have a consequence for the must being breached. And so whatever is really going on, I know there are really sensitive issues going on in our society at the moment about sex and gender, which we will not, I suspect, resolve tonight. I guess. We might, but maybe not. But in the meantime, what we... by the way, I so agree with my noble friend about the value of data. Whether in the health service, whether in the criminal justice system, data is great, but there's another side to this too, isn't there? Which I think my noble friend acknowledged, which is that data will put some people off. There are other jurisdictions not far from here where people are really nervous about even declaring their race because of obvious historic reasons for being sensitive about declaring your race at the police station, right? Let alone declaring your birth sex. So we need to see the yin and yang of this particular debate. On the one hand, what brilliant research we could do, what brilliant analysis of crime we could do if we had just more and more data. But on the other hand, because ultimately, it's not completely different from a previous debate. On the other hand, what we want is victims to come forward and criminal justice to be done. And we don't want to do anything that discourages victims from coming forward and reporting crime. And that includes people who feel anxious about certain sensitive pieces of information about themselves, and we would never want them to put off going to the police station for fear that they say more than, you know, I've been burgled. Was I burgled just because I was burgled or because I'm a trans person or whatever it is? Do I really want to draw more attention to myself because I'm an anxious victim of crime? We need to think about that, and let alone the poor old practicalities of a younger version of the very youthful-looking Lord Paddock.
My Lords, I thank the noble Baroness Chakrabarty for the introducing my speech. My Lords, this amendment is designed to compel police forces to keep a record of the sex registered at birth of anyone who is a crime victim or who is arrested by the police for a crime. It also forces the police to keep a record of the acquired gender of each person with a gender recognition certificate who is a crime victim or is arrested for a crime. It also says that providing this data to the Secretary of State will not be an offence under the Gender Recognition Act. Again, I want to try and focus on the amendment and not to get drawn into the wider debate as far as I can. But as the noble Baroness pointed out, I was a police officer for over 30 years, so I want to look at this from the perspective of the police. How will a police officer know what the sex registered at birth is? Thumb screws? A chromosome test? Even without the consent of the victim? Maybe force victims to give their fingerprints in the hope that they may have had their fingerprints taken before they transitioned. And that will prove it. Except they may have had them taken after they transitioned, and that will then show their acquired gender. So that won't work. Will victims have to produce their birth certificates before they are even allowed to report a crime? Of course, if someone has acquired a gender recognition certificate and has used that to have their birth certificate changed, as they are legally allowed to do, the birth certificate will show their acquired gender. So that won't work either. How exactly will police forces keep a record of something they do not know, have no reasonable way of finding out, unless the victim or perpetrator volunteers the information? And if the victim or the perpetrator is a trans person, they are legally protected from having to disclose that information. Well, it's obvious, some people would say, you can tell, can't you? My Lords, I have met trans men who you would never believe were assigned female sex at birth, and trans women who you would never believe were assigned male sex at birth. I have also, embarrassingly, been with a lesbian friend of mine assigned the sex, female sex at birth, and who's always identified as a woman, who was stopped going into a woman's toilet in a top London restaurant because they wrongly thought that she was a man. The supporters of this amendment may say, well, if they do find out, the police do find out, maybe they can record it. Maybe the victim is reporting a transphobic hate crime or some other reason volunteers that information. Well, the second part of the amendment, my Lords, is totally unnecessary. The Gender Recognition Act 2004, Section 22, subsection 4, already states, and I quote, "But it is not an offence under this section to disclose protected information relating to a person if B, that person has agreed to the disclosure of the information, for example, they are the victim of a trans hate crime, and later in the same section, subsection F, the disclosure is for the purpose of preventing or investigating crime." So the police can use that information already without fear of being prosecuted. So the amendment is not necessary if the victim or perpetrator volunteers the information. But as my noble friend Baroness Brinton talked about will she have to declare every time she becomes a victim of crime, even if it's a burglary, that she has a disability? What about me? Will the next step be that I have to tell the police that I am gay before I can report that my flat has been broken into? For what purpose should victims have to out themselves? Or if I get caught stealing a bottle of Marks and Spencer Prosecco? I haven't tried, but, you know, it's very good, actually. I had some on Saturday. But if I did, will I have to admit being gay as well as to admit to being, being a shoplifter. In 2018, the government tentatively estimated that there were between 200,000 and 500,000 trans people in the UK. Between the Gender Recognition Act coming into force in 2018, noble lords have said they like data. I'm going to give you lots of data. Between the Gender Recognition Act coming into force in 2018 coming into force and 2018, 4,910 trans people had been issued with a gender recognition certificate. If we take the top of the range of the estimate, I make that 0.75 of the population identifying as trans and 0.0076% of the overall population having a gender recognition certificate, or less than 1 in 10,000 people. Even if a victim went through the whole criminal justice process without disclosing or the police establishing the sex assigned to them at birth, if they were a trans woman, it would increase the number of woman victims. If they were a trans man, it would diminish the number of woman victims, and taken together and taking account of the total number of trans people, it would even out. Taking into account that only a fraction of them will become victims of crime, who report the crime to the police, any difference to the crime statistics will be statistically insignificant. The police arrest, on average, 12 in 1,000 people each year, 3 in 1,000 women. I don't know how many of the estimated 7.5 in 1,000 trans people are trans women, and how many are trans men. Of course, if trans women are counted in the female offender figures, they will also be counted in the female population figures, boosting both the numerator and the denominator. My lords, I was never any good at mathematics. I left that to my twin brother. But it's quite clear to me that trans people are not going to make any statistically significant difference to the crime figures unless you assume, and there is no factual or statistical basis to think otherwise, that trans people are more likely to commit crime or more likely to commit particular types of crime. My lord, some people will point to rape statistics, and I think somebody has already mentioned it this evening. They will say only men can commit rape, and therefore any woman who is recorded as having been convicted of rape must be a trans woman. That is not true. If a woman acts in joint enterprise with a man in order to commit rape, they are both guilty of rape, whether it is restraining the victim, drugging the victim, or if a woman in any other way acts as an accessory to the rape. My lords, there is no evidence that the tiny proportion of trans people in the population, of which an even smaller proportion will be trans women, of which an even smaller proportion will have a gender recognition certificate, and an even smaller proportion that will commit crime or become a victim, an even smaller proportion of those who will be arrested, will make any significant difference to recorded crime, whether as victims or perpetrators. And the noble Lord, Lord Wasserman, says that this is a serious gap in our crime statistics. Is the noble Lord really saying, after all his experience with the police, with working on the CRIS system in the Metropolitan Police, that this is a significant gap in the crime statistics based on the data that I have just told the committee? This amendment is unreasonable, impractical, and unnecessary, and we oppose it.
My Lords, interesting points have been raised by members around the Chamber. And indeed, I agree with noble Baroness, my noble friend Baroness Morris, about the need for data. How you collect that and what data you collect is always the issue. But data is essential, obviously. We do have some concerns around this particular amendment regarding its breadth and the inclusion of victims. As Baroness Brinton and indeed Lord Paddock have just pointed out in the debate, to require a person who is a victim of crime of anything from, say, theft of a pet up to violent robbery to record their sex at birth in order to report that crime and interact with the criminal justice system, in my view, is quite troubling and may actually have a significant effect on anybody potentially coming forward if that's an actual requirement of every single victim for every single crime. I think that may well act as an impediment to them coming forward and a consideration. Having said that, there are some concerns around certain types of crime, namely rape and sexual violence. And I agree with what Lord Paddock said about the actual, what the data says, but I think the impact on victims of how these crimes are recorded does vary between police forces in a way which is not helpful either. I did a little bit of research, and I just preface this with the only figures the way I could find was a couple of years old. So if this is out of date, then I apologise, but it did point to a problem, I think, around this. Just to quote, police forces are recording suspected and convicted rapists as female if they no longer wish to identify with their male birth sex. However, 6 forces, I won't name them, disclosed under freedom of information laws that if someone is arrested for or convicted of rape, the official record will state the gender they chose to identify themselves as. However, a further 5 forces didn't answer the question directly, but each said they recorded gender in line with the person's wishes. So, irrespective of what the rights and wrongs of what that data would tell us, I don't think it's helpful to have that difference in such a stark way between lots of different forces. And that goes to the point, I think that's the point that Baroness Morrison, unless I misunderstood her, was making. And something I do think is that consistency of data which can be applied in a way which you can learn from it and make judgments about. And with those brief remarks, those are the only comments I would make on this amendment.
Well, may I start by thanking my noble friend Lord Wasserman and others for explaining this amendment, which relate to the recording of sex and gender by the police. Just to begin, the government does not currently stipulate how a victim's or offender's sex at birth or gender identity must be recorded by the police. It's an operational matter for each individual police force to decide what information to record in cases where a crime is committed, taking into account any relevant national guidance. There are no other instances across government where there is a mandatory requirement to record both a person's sex as registered at birth, as well as the required gender, if this is applicable. The Office for Statistics Regulation is clear that it is for each department to decide when and how they collect data, including data on both sex and gender. We have already stated that we don't plan to require biological sex to be recorded across the criminal justice system in its response to a recent petition calling for the biological sex of violent and sexual offenders to be recorded throughout the criminal justice system. The response cited the practical difficulties in determining biological sex, some of which have been cited this evening, as well as implications for those with a gender recognition certificate or a GRC, as justification, implications of which I'll touch on later. I understand that this issue has received media attention, with media reporting that there have been cases of sexual offences committed by transgender women where these crimes, which are traditionally male crimes, have been recorded as being committed by women. The Daily Mail also reported that the Home Office is working with police to develop a new procedure for officers to record the sex of criminals to ensure crime statistics are more accurate. As noted in much of this reporting, the Home Office has already started work with the National Police Chiefs Council to promote, and lots of noble lords have said this words, standardised approach to the recording of all protected characteristics, which is currently at an early stage. Further, the Office for Statistics Regulation has also issued draft guidance for the collection of sex and gender data for public bodies. This work should bring greater accuracy and consistency of the recording of sex and gender and allow the police to understand how best to collect it. It is through these processes, I think, my lords, rather than legislation, that it is important to improve the accuracy of recording of sex and gender. There are a number of legal concerns arising from the amendment. It is unclear why the government would need to mandate the uniform recording of this information as regards both alleged victims and perpetrators for all offences, and how this would be considered both necessary and proportionate for operational purposes. Accordingly, it could amount to an unlawful interference in someone's rights to respect their private and family life under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. This requirement might also breach Article 14 on the basis that it amounts to discrimination where transgender individuals are concerned. It is not clear, due to the scope of the amendment, that such a requirement could be lawfully justified. I put it to the committee that legislating so that the police routinely record this type of data is not the solution to the problem of standardising how sex and gender are recorded. There are reasonable and appropriate actions already being taken to address this that don't carry the same potential consequences as mandating it by law. There will be more to be said on this in the coming months, as the noble lady, Lady Chakrabarti, said, but I hope that for now I've said enough to reassure my noble friend to withdraw his amendment.
My Lords, I'm grateful to my noble friend the Minister for her comments, thoughtful and helpful as ever. I can reassure the noble lady Baroness Brinton, who can now turn off after midnight, that I will withdraw my amendment, and she needn't worry about any more debate. But the point I wanted to make just now is to say that I recognise very much the problems of collecting this information. And that's why I went out my way to speak at some length about the Home Office counting rules. I happened to be involved at that stage when I was back in the Home Office with the development of the counting rules, and they very much are based on consultations with the National Police Chiefs Council and others, and experts and think tanks and academics and so on. And I did say that in my speech that these rules ensure that the collection arrangements are easily amended in the light of practical experience on the ground. And I have no doubt that if any debate about the collection of such information will get careful consideration by the experts both at the Home Office and who run the counting rules, at the police and others. Having said that, I still think it's important to have national criminal information. And one of the weaknesses of our system, as we had in an earlier debate on this bill, 43 separate forces with 43 chief constables, each deciding which way they're going to count the criminal statistics or collect and maintain the criminal statistics, is not the best way to do it. Some noble lords will no doubt suggest that we want, therefore, a single police force, as in Scotland. I don't think that's such a good idea, but I think there's another way of doing it, which is setting clear rules, which Parliament sets at high level, and then having the experts decide how best to collect this information sensitively, with due respect to human rights, to people's deepest feelings, and generally ensuring that they take the population with them. Having said that, I withdraw this amendment. I seek leave to withdraw this amendment.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn.
My Lords, I beg to move the House be resumed.
The question is that the House be resumed. As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.